Okay, everyone, today we're going to discuss the Russian Revolution. It is very, very dramatic, and let's just get right into it. All right, so the Russians are struggling. When last we left, we talked about assassinations, we talked about poor leadership, we talked about the peasants getting beaten up, and now the country itself is going to start to have some problems. Most notably, the Russo-Japanese War in the early 1900s. The Japanese were looking to expand, and they saw Russia as a target. They also saw it as a way for them to be a little bit more imperial and look cool like the Europeans, and they would be very successful. They basically put a beat down on the Russians. They eliminate their navy, and in the end, they also make Teddy Roosevelt look quite nice. In that Teddy is able to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth or Portsmouth, depending on which one you want to go with, in Oregon, that ends the war and gives him a Nobel Peace Prize. Score! First US president to do that. And the Russians look terrible. This will then be followed in 1905 with actually the first stab at a Russian revolution. And it was mainly done by workers and labor, and we've said they have horrible conditions. The factories are terrible. The peasants have no rights. Even though they're not serfs, it's not like they can go anywhere. People start speaking out a lot, and then the more problematic ones start getting killed by secret police, as per the standard. In January of 1905, a crowd, as you can actually see in the background picture, gathers outside of the Winter Palace to protest. They are demanding that Nicholas II actually, do something, and they are then promptly shot by troops completely unprovoked. Hundreds are killed, thousands of wounded. It's known as Bloody Sunday, and it's just not good. Now, normally in the past, the people would not, step down because they're nervous or they're scared. This time, they're having none of it. Chaos is going to break out across the country. Something known as the Soviets will be interesting later on, will be formed. These are like small kind of councils or almost unions of groups of workers and peasants that are starting to come together to develop ways that they want to resist. One group actually will go as far as assassinating the uncle of the Tsar at the time, who was Nicholas II, the Grand Duke Sergei. Then, on board the battleship Potemkin, the crew will mutiny because they do not want to follow the leader anymore. I mean, most of them end up getting killed, but it still happens anyway. Then at one point, all the rail workers go on strikes, and you get worker riots that go crazy, and basically every single time troops come in. Now, I have some changes here, and the idea is that Nicholas is going to try to reform some things and try to fix situations for the peasants and stuff, but he won't bring in a constitution. He won't go constitutional monarchy. There's still massive censorship, and there's still the secret police. So who is this guy, Nicholas II? Well, it's Nicholas II and his wife Alexandra, as you can see there by the picture. He's sitting, she's tall, and those are all real gemstones she's wearing, so I don't even want to know how much that jacket costs, but I want his hat. So anyway, they are they're just bad. They're bad rulers. Nicholas is a bad ruler, and it's in the end because he's a really dedicated family man, as I'll explain in a moment when I start talking about his son Alexei. But he he was a guy that I don't know how much he even wanted to be the czar, as we get from some writings. He was more of a low key guy. He often has people call him Nicky. He didn't want to be there. And not surprisingly, that doesn't really bode well when you're a czar in times of chaos. He was often guided by others, and then the actions that he took were just ineffective. Letting troops kill peasants. I mean, it's really just a mess. Okay, but in the end, it's kind of a sad story. He was very dedicated, and he was dedicated to his son Alexei. There's Alexei actually being ridden around by his father on this little bike with a makeshift seat in front. Alexei had hemophilia and a number of other issues that had the boy always sick and in pain. And the royal family would really do anything they could to help the youngest of all his children. He had a bunch of daughters too, and they were just distracted in spending so much time, and that distraction and their dedicatedness, if you will, to their son leads to a major, major mistake. And that mistake is one Grigory Rasputin. Look at his eyes. It's creepy. He scares me. Now, Rasputin was a monk from Inner Russia. He was married at a couple points. He actually had a few kids, a son, a couple daughters, but also a notorious womanizer. Some would even call it to be a lecher, but it was said that he was a healer. And when the Tsarina Alexandra heard of this man, she brought him to St. Petersburg and asked him to treat her son. Now, whether or not you believe it, but it seems like he was able to do something to ease the young boy's pain and make him feel better. That he would kind of be active, and everything seemed to be pretty happy. The problem is that he starts to use his position as a doctor, if you will, to influence the Tsarina and the Tsar. And some people go as far as to say that Rasputin was getting to the point where he was really going to be able to run the country. Now, what you need to understand is that Russia is a very conservative nation at this point, still very conservative today. And having this kind of womanizer monk that a lot of people thought was a fraud, possibly running a country, was no good. Now, while all this is going on, World War I has broken out. Okay, the Russians are losing millions of men. You know, King, or not King, Tsar Nicholas had actually sent them into battle on horses at one point. They're getting mowed down by machine guns. I mean, it's just looking awful. And then here, this guy is possibly running the show. So eventually, someone has to take matters into their own hands, and Rasputin is assassinated. Now, the story is crazy, but here we go. He was invited to a duke's house to supposedly meet some women and maybe his wife and have a little, maybe the duke's wife, and even have a little bit of an affair. Kind of crazy. Basically, a very naughty party, if you will. So when he gets there, he is met by a couple guys, and they say, "Oh, we're going to have some food and this or that." So they sit down, he eats some dessert, some petit fours, and they are laced with cyanide, and they don't kill him like at all. And so the guys start getting nervous. They're like, this guy ate cyanide and he's not dead. So they're like, well, we got some ladies over here. And supposedly they lure him down to like a basement room where they shoot him. Now, an autopsy was done. It was said he is shot twice, and one of them penetrates like the liver and the other the intestines. I mean, normally you die. So they're like, all right, good, we shot him, great. So they go upstairs and try to figure out where they're going to put the body. Well, while they're sitting upstairs, they hear some noises and they see Rasputin running around outside trying to escape. So, no, he wasn't killed. They run back out. They shoot him again, this bullet evidently going through the stomach. They drag him back inside, and they're like, all right, it's good. Well, another like 20 or 30 minutes later, he's moving again. So this time they shoot him in the head, and they take his body and they dump it in the river. Now, there's a couple different autopsy reports that are out there. One says that it's the bullet to the head that killed him, although cyanide was found in his system, which, by the way, if you so much as touch a little bit of cyanide, you die. Don't go near cyanide. And then the other autopsy report supposedly says he dies from drowning. But this is crazy. And just a random interesting story. It's a little bit of a side note, but the idea that the Rasputin affair, Rasputin is killed in 1916, but it's kind of like the ultimate point where the people have just had it. And finally, in February of 1917, you will get a revolution. People start revolting all over Russia. They're protesting that they should pull out of the war. There are a number of women who protest around the Winter Palace, very similar to the French Revolution. And eventually, the generals in the army will side for the revolution with the revolutionaries and all call for Nicholas to step down, which he will in 1917. Now, this is not the commies, sorry, not yet. What you have here is a democracy is formed, your basic democratic type government, which would be led by a man by the name of Alexander Kerensky. And I know I might have mentioned this before, but fun fact, I taught his great granddaughter. She lived in Marlton. The problem is that they're trying to fight this war and they're trying to run elections, and it's all really, really a mess. And that's where this man, I'm sorry, you have the provisional government here. I don't know why I have a double slide, but it's okay. That's where this man, Vladimir Lenin, will come in. Vladimir Lenin was a young boy whose brother was actually a revolutionary. His brother was actually arrested and murdered for said revolution, and that never sat well with Lenin. He starts studying, and he becomes a very deep Marxist, or communist. Now he starts to speak, and he becomes very, very popular. And for whatever reason, he is not killed by the Russian authorities. He is arrested. He's sent to jail for a little while, and then he's exiled. And in exile, he is going to continue to speak and write and watch Russia very, very closely. And it is in April of 1917 that he issues a series of writings called the April Theses from Switzerland, where he was at, calling for a Bolshevik, or the Communist Party, revolution, and that the Soviets need to band together and take over Russia because the provisional government is not very effective. Now, the Germans see this as a fantastic opportunity to get rid of someone who is in the war. So, what the Germans will do is they will smuggle him on a train back into Russia to start a revolt. And indeed, in October of 1917, there is a revolution against the provisional government. Lenin wants to create a socialist state with communism as an economic system. And he is able to get back in. He is able to recruit people from the army. And what he is also able to do is run for election, in which the Bolsheviks will take over a majority of seats in the Russian Congress. And what they do is they are able to upend and get rid of Alexander Kerensky legally. And at this point, the Soviet Union is then born. All private land was taken over, factories, and the banks are all now controlled by the government. The wages are fixed, and you get a nice 8-hour workday, but communism is now in full effect. So the revolution is successful, and this is a big-time revolution. The commoners are overthrowing. You're talking about your first ever socialist state that is established. Okay, but then you get the Russian Civil War. There are many that were against the Bolsheviks, and in early 1918, after the Russians had removed themselves from the war, they will make a treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, with the Germans, and they will bow out in 1917, one of the final reasons why the U.S. jumped in. And basically, you have two sides of this war. You have the Reds, who are the forces of Lenin, that's why communism is associated with the color red, and the Whites, which were those opposed to it, many of which wanting to establish a constitutional monarchy. And this war went on from 1918 to 1922. And the big moment happened in 1919 when, as you see here, this is a picture of the royal family who Lenin was able to capture. This is the last picture that was ever taken of them. They were captured. They were brought to a room to take a photo, which this was. Shortly thereafter, they were removed to another room where they were shot by a firing squad. The crazy story was that the girls, to give you an idea of how lavish the Russian monarchy was, the girls had so many diamonds. You can see it a little bit here. You see the diamonds, okay? A little bit here. See it a little bit there. So many diamonds in their dresses that the bullets actually ricocheted off it and almost hit some of the guys shooting them. But alas, they were all killed. Now, interestingly enough, the U.S. and Britain actually aid the Whites, but the Reds prevail. And the Soviet Union is now fully embodied. Now, unfortunately, the communists win, but Lenin shortly dies thereafter in 1924 from a stroke, and that leads us to might be considered the second most evil man ever, Joseph Stalin. After Lenin's death in 1924, he is able to seize power, and he is one of the most brutal rulers in history. We believe that at least 20 million of his own people were killed as a result of his actions. And I said before, he was a horrible, horrible person. He was brutal to his own son, so much so that his son tried to commit suicide, but he botched the attempt. He tried to shoot himself, to which Stalin then replied that he was never a good shot, and then allowed his son to die in a German war camp during World War II. He is going to industrialize the country, and I have to give him credit for that. They are going to be one of the largest producers of industrial goods in the world, to the point they will actually have the largest largest army in the world and be really big on heavy industry and energy. They also would eventually create the world's largest atomic bomb. However, in order to get all this done, he did something called collectivization, which was a series of 5 year plans in which peasants were forced to work on farms to make food for the rest of the country. In order to do this, the land was often overworked, resulting in massive amounts of famines that killed millions of people. He also had his infamous purges, in which anybody who was thought to be a threat to Stalin will be killed, very similar to Hitler. Thousands upon thousands of people were killed as a result. They would all be put on quote unquote trial. And he would hunt you down anywhere. His most notable rival was a guy by the name of Leon Trotsky, who he and Stalin were both like Lenin's right hand men. Stalin was able to seize power from Trotsky. Trotsky fled, but was actually killed by a assassin sent by Stalin all the way in Mexico City with an ice pick. It was ugly. What you can say about Stalin is brutal, evil, horrible, but he turned Russia into one of the most powerful countries in the world. And Russia is still one of the most powerful countries in the world. And it became as a result of Stalin. And we'll be getting more into that a little bit later. But Russia has now gone officially from, I mean, you can't get a bigger revolution than this. You go from a strict monarchical state all the way to a socialist style communist government, leans back toward dictatorship, which we know from discussing communism, but nonetheless, Stalin would go on and change the world. All right, guys, make sure you get those notes, and I will see you tomorrow.